You're listening to Jay's Analysis. This is the introduction to the Jay's Analysis podcast. The only authoritative source for Jay's Analysis is Jay's Analysis. Film, philosophy, geopolitics, the esoteric, and much, much more. Satire and comedy too. Now added bonus for free. One of the more difficult topics to dissect is the topic of Neoplatonism in Christianity, and I put a lot of years into this question because it is very taxing. It's very intricate, but we can come to some understanding on this, and the purpose of this video is going to be a kind of a rough introduction to the longer talk that I'm going to do. Now, I've been reading recently Michael Hoffman's new book, The Occult Renaissance Church of Rome, and as you can see, I'm about almost halfway. So I just got this the other day, and I'm about halfway through the 700-page attack on the last 500 to 800 years of Western Roman Catholicism. And most of what's in here, I think, is correct. Everything I've seen so far is pretty solid. There's a couple areas where I take issue with Hoffman, particularly where it's related to the character of Augustine. If you look at Plotinus's Enneads, the filioque that Augustine pioneered, and which was subsequently dogmatized by the Council of Toledo with papal approval, which you can also find a dissection of in my essay that I just wrote about Arian arguments being used by filioquists. So it's actually an inverse. It does not at all achieve the purpose for which the filioque was intended. But we're going to not really delve into Augustine and all that right now, because the main point of this is to do a bit of a review of the first half of Hoffman's book, and then maybe my own thoughts on it. But as I said, over the last 10, 15 years, this is a topic that's been very central to me. In my 20s, I was very much into Thomism. And prior to that, also the Augustinian tradition. So, most of my 20s I spent reading those two guys in mass. Obviously, I read other things too. I wasn't just studying Thomism, but those things were something I took very serious. They weren't ideologies that I adopted happenstance or willy-nilly. I really put the time and the effort into it, and so I have my Summa over here, and I have tremendous amounts of notes in it. As well as the Summa Contra Gentiles, the other work, as well as I have the Catena Aurea of Aquinas well, which is a commentary on the Gospels, and other philosophical works, De Veritate and so forth. So I'm not unfamiliar with this territory. I know it very well. I know very in depth the nature of Thomism, and it's a lot more complex than a lot of times the way we want to break it down. Now, that's not an attack on Hoffman's book, although he does still have a bit of a regard for Aquinas that I wouldn't have, with all of the errors of created grace and beatific vision and filioque and on and on and on that occur in the Summa Theologica. It really doesn't matter about those guys and their opinions, because when it comes to the topic of Roman Catholicism, what matters is what's dogma. And it's very clearly made dogma in Vatican I that the ordinary universal teaching magisterium of the Church cannot err. So when you read a book like Denzinger, which I've read the entirety of Denzinger, is the totality of what's more or less dogmatic. It was put together before the Second Vatican Council. So it constitutes dogma for, normatively speaking, for Roman Catholicism, or it's supposed to, if they're consistent with it. Of course, they don't always follow that, but that's a different question of all the dogmas. But what Hoffman does is that he deconstructs some of the influences, and that's very accurate, very appropriate. It echoes the work of Dr. Farrell in God, History, and Dialectic, which is really just a systematization of the critiques from the Orthodox perspective over the last however many hundreds of years, right? It's not new, it's not fresh arguments, it's really just a systematization, and it's done very well. And shorter books like James Kelly's Anatomizing Divinity that I've done many interviews with, his book is a good presentation of the same theme. But again, we have to eventually let go of some of these Augustinian ideas that just are not biblical. Now, that's not to be unfair to Augustine, because again, when I converted to Roman Catholicism back in, I don't know, 2001 or 2, I took his name. So I'm very familiar with what he teaches. I know what's on the Trinity. I know what's on baptism and against the Donatists, and I know what's in retractions and soliloquies and on and on and on. So to be fair, obviously the later Augustine was a lot more biblical in his approach. He did shed a lot of that philosophical baggage, but it really doesn't matter, because we don't build our theology on a guy. We don't build our theology on Aquinas. We build our theology on the Bible, and then by extension, the church universally, what the church has always believed everywhere and at all times. And the Augustinian argumentation for the filioque, as well as the very, very bad argument that I elucidated with absolute clarity in my article, that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the will of God, that's an Arian argument for why the Son is a creation. So the subordinationism that is often mentioned in terms of God and Arianism and all that actually applies most coherently to filioquism. And I've sent this piece to numerous Catholics, numerous Catholic apologists. Nobody has responded to it yet or given it any adequate defense. And there's not going to be a defense, because it's in your dogma. So that human psychological analogy of mind and will, and the spirit being will, and all the stuff that's read up into the Trinity, that's wrong, and we have to let that go. And once we do that, and we get back to what's in the councils and what's in the fathers whose theology has been confirmed by the Universal Church already, in the first 7/8 councils, which deal specifically with Christology and the Triad. I mean, those teachings are they're pretty solid. I mean, they line up. They make sense. They give balance to what we believe. And all the deviations, be it filioquism, be it papism, you can all trace them back to deviations that relate to Christology or the relationship between God and the world. So what we're going to talk about now is the subject matter of Hoffman's book. What is the relationship of God to the world? And can we look to Plotinus and Plato and Plethon and all of these Neoplatonic and Platonic, Middle Platonic guys who are coming up with their ratio mathematical mysticism as a way to understand God? And I think that the answer is no, and that's an emphatic no, because so much of the early patristic argumentation when it comes to the nature of God, or the questions of Christology and the natures of Christ and so forth, all those questions are not grounded in obscure Neoplatonic arguments. They're grounded in the Bible, and you'll see that very clearly when you read through their works, especially somebody like Athanasius, or if you read St. Cyril of Jerusalem, St. Cyril of Alexandria, if you read St. Gregory of Palamas 1,000 years later, the arguments are consistently Bible, 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 Bible. And if there's ever a philosophical subtlety or clarification that's brought in, it's merely for a teaching tool. We might use the term monad, and I believe that if the church fathers ever use that term, like when Athanasius and De Synodis is arguing with about the Arians, he's making fun of the way that they talk about the monad, and then it being what creates a dyad. So they're relying on Neoplatonism. When St. Basil is arguing with heretics, he points out that the I am, the toon, I am being, supposedly, that's not a Greek philosophical statement in Exodus. That's not God is not saying, I am super existent essence, I am super existent being. He's not saying that. He's saying, I am the personal God that has the covenantal relationship with Israel, right? So the error has been that when the church and different apologists like Origen were trying to convert their friends who were very steeped in Greek philosophy, a lot of times they were speaking the Greek philosophical lingo to try to have a common ground. Now, I don't think that that's inherently necessarily always wrong, but it's a little bit dangerous. I mean, John does this in John 1:1, where he talks about the Logos, and certainly the Koine Greek New Testament would have been going out to people who spoke Koine Greek. So it's not that it's wrong, the terms inherently are wrong, it's rather the context and what you mean by them. So, for example, hypostasis, the personhood that's spoken of as characterizing the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, this person aspect, that is not from Plotinus. It's not from the Enneads. It doesn't originate in Greek philosophers in Athens. It comes out of the New Testament, right? The New Testament uses the Greek term hypostasis, and this was, again, originating probably ultimately in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which is generally speaking what the New Testament writers relied on, was the Septuagint. So that's kind of the norm in the Orthodox churches, generally speaking, is the Septuagint and that terminology. But again, as I've shown in my Logos talk, where we go to St. John Damascus's exposition of the Orthodox faith, what we see is that it's clear that the context for these terms and words, the one, right, the triad, it's not what Plato meant. Okay, so again, if you look at the Enneads, if you look at the third and the fifth Ennead of Plotinus, you'll see that Plotinus makes these arguments of how the monad and the dyad love one another, and then that love creates this third hypostasis, which is spirit or something. Now, that's obviously clearly what is being said by Augustine when he tries to make this very new argument for the filioque. And this spirit proceeding from will and being will, which is, again, no, there's no way to make that orthodox because it's an Arian argument. So all that to say that Hoffman's book is another witness, another researcher coming to the conclusions that I came to, that many have come to, for the most part, 10 years or so ago, when it was really a question of what is the perennial philosophy? What is this? How does it relate to Neoplatonism? How does it relate to the Jewish mysticism in the Kabbalah? How does that relate to the topics of the Renaissance guys like Marsilio Ficino and Cornelius Agrippa, and who else? Johann Reuchlin, and these different guys who were very interested in utilizing Kabbalistic structures to try to convert Jews, or as a means by which the church might be able to improve upon its theology of who Christ is and all this kind of stuff, and divine Plato, as he's called. Now, this, as Hoffman correctly argues, has been the dominant trend since the Renaissance in the Renaissance papacy. And we need to look no further than the art and architecture of Rome to see that confirmed. And that's ultimately what starts becoming the problem. Is it's not just philosophers philosophizing, it's also very weird artworks. I remember when I was getting really into Roman Catholicism back in my 20s, I took a tour of the one of the actually it's an Episcopal cathedral. I'm not making this up, you can look it up. There's an Episcopal cathedral in Memphis, and when you go in there, there's a giant blonde hair, blue eye Aryan Jesus. I don't know why they made him an Aryan Jesus, but there's this, and then he's like facing opposite of a Michael the Archangel who's holding a scroll with E = MC squared on it, with Einstein's dictum on it. Now, I did a little research on this guy. I don't remember his name, but he was a very well-respected Roman artisan an artist, and I think he did a lot of work for Pius XII and different popes and whatnot. He's designed various cathedrals. So, the point being, it's not just a Episcopalian thing. He's also very important for all of the Roman Catholic cathedrals that he's designed. And then you start to think, well, now wait a minute. So there is actually all this bizarre alchemical imagery and all these kinds of images that are that populate the cathedrals of Roman Catholicism. Now, why would that be? And that's what we're going to look at as we get into this book. It is going to be precisely because the West was not just corrupted through Renaissance and Hermeticism and all this kind of stuff from the year 1500 on or 1200 on. There's a deeper root that is actually the philosophical presuppositions of absolute divine simplicity, of filioquism, of created grace, of the natural immortality of the soul as opposed to the body. All of these things were already condemned in the church. The soul is not naturally immortal. It's what Christ grants to it through the incarnation, death, burial, and resurrection. That's how we participate in the immortality that God has promised us in the resurrection. And so very, very different doctrines is what I'm trying to point out here. And so all the more absurd, by the way, then for Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox to try to mesh together because the theology is not compatible. It's not compatible because Neoplatonism is not compatible with the Bible, simply put. So what I want to do in this talk is get into middle and later Platonism, and particularly the character of Plotinus. And Plotinus is important because his philosophy is very influential in the West, and it leads to a whole host of controversies and debates, and particularly in relationship to the Christian church in the first several centuries, and then even into the Middle Ages. The character of Plotinus and his Enneads, first of all, are going to be the most relevant for influencing characters like Augustine. Now, if you read a book like City of God, for the most part, City of God is something that we would consider, an orthodox book. It does contain several sections of speculation, but the first half of the book is Augustine's critique of the pagan world, the city of man, as he calls it, and accurately so. We would say that the city of man is flawed precisely because it, all the way back to what we read in Genesis 6 or Genesis 10 and 11, the Tower of Babel, has basically been trying to erect a culture, a society around the worship of man / idolatry / the devil. And so the idea here is that all of the pagan empires in the past pretty much collapse into that pattern. This is the entire experience of Israel as a nation, with the Babylonian captivity and the destruction of the temple. It's the experience of most of mankind throughout history is to be subjected to some form of pagan, human-based law that is tyrannical. And so this is not always totally brutal. There was times where the empires might provide a lot of peace. And so you'll read in sections in Isaiah about Darius and Cyrus, about Cyrus in Isaiah and Darius with Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar and so forth. And at times these guys might have even been converted by the prophets. We don't exactly know, but we get hints of that perhaps, like with in the book of Daniel when he interacts with Nebuchadnezzar. But regardless, for the most part, the pagan empires are a thorn in the side of God's people. And then certainly for the first few centuries of Christianity, the empire is very virulent on persecuting Christians. But the persecution, quote unquote, of the church and of our theology doesn't always come in the form of overt attack through dictators or kings or armies. It can also come at times through subtle philosophical wranglings and sophistry. And one of those issues, I think you could argue, is shown, one of those examples is very clearly shown in the example of Plotinus. Now, I'm not saying that Plotinus was necessarily Christian, but as we saw in the talk that I did on the older Greek guys, Heraclitus and Parmenides and the Ionians, and then into Plato and Platonism, we saw a lot of figures who were perhaps, into the Roman period, as it's called, the Stoics, who were probably drawing from several different well springs. Maybe even Marcus Aurelius. Some of these guys were probably influenced in some degree by Christian thought, early theologians. But even though that's still a little unclear, we know that there were, dialogues between different early church writers, writing letters to different Roman rulers and so forth, trying to explain that, their position was not anti-authoritarian in itself, that it was just based on the law of God, and that, they couldn't, in good conscience, sacrifice to idols and so forth. Now, that philosophy of Plotinus is crucial because it will present one of the most subtle sort of challenges, and will influence some people to move in the direction of Platonism. If I recall, Celsus, one of the guys who Origen was very pathetically trying to debate with, Celsus was a Neoplatonist. And so you get a lot of that same tendency of the Platonic argumentation trying to show that Christianity is foolish because it relies on the Old Testament being historical. And so this is why when Irenaeus writes his big treatise against heresies in, I think, 180 or so, somewhere in there, Irenaeus is battling a lot of Gnosticism. And so Gnosticism and Platonism, Neoplatonism, these are very, very close cousins. They're very influenced perhaps one another at times. And so there's not exactly one Neoplatonic thing that you can go to. Sometimes you get these guys like Iamblichus, who is more of a ceremonial magician type guy. Sometimes you get characters like Plotinus, where it's not so much about ceremonial rituals as it is the individual in his own inner gnosis, the intuitive spark of the inner divine and so forth, and that this is how the soul ascends into the higher planetary realms and spheres up to the one. As we see, we're going to see that's the argumentation of Plotinus, particularly in the Enneads. But if you recall, we did many lectures on Plato and the dialogues and the entirety of the Republic, and people can go back and listen to those. But the Phaedo, the Phaedrus, Symposium, Timaeus, Republic, these all provide the skeletal outline for what will influence Plotinus. And what he does is kind of dispense with all the Socratic dialogue. It says, out with all that stuff, let's just have a more direct, almost a sort of a philo-theological treatise is kind of what the Enneads are. It's not really making a distinction between those two, because in Plotinian thought, there's not a distinction between the knowledge or gnosis that you gain in philosophy and theology. They're basically the same endeavors. And so, by extension, obviously, there's no revelation. All experience of the forms and phenomena are themselves, quote, revelation, you could say, in Plotinian thought. But if we remember, I think I did do at least an article on the Phaedo and then a talk on it, I think. I still haven't gotten to the Timaeus yet. I've read it, obviously, but I haven't done a lecture on it. But if we recall, that's this sort of Egyptian Gnostic creation cosmogony of Plato is the Timaeus. And it's where we get a lot of the esoteric symbolism that continues into the Western tradition. The snake and the egg and the Ouroboros and all that's out of the Timaeus. The Platonic solids come out of the Timaeus. And then, of course, we know everything that's in the Republic. We did a lecture on each one of the books of the Republic. So if we recall all that, and if we remember the talk that I did a couple months ago about the mysteries of the early Greeks, or something to that effect, I forget exactly what I titled it, but something like that, where we did a critique of the dialectics of the Greeks and the one and the many. And that's kind of what it all boiled down to, was this presupposition of setting the one in contrast, contradistinction, dialectical tension, and opposition with the many, and vice versa. Now, when you get to Plotinus, as we said, we've dispensed with Socratic tales and storytelling and myths, and we've kind of tried to boil it into more of a principled, logical, philosophical treatise that is metaphysical. So it's a logical, rational approach to metaphysics, trying to posit different tiers, structures, and levels of reality. So what does he argue? Well, in these Enneads, he is giving this metaphysical structure, and we're going to kind of go in summary here. Obviously, it's a fairly long book, so we're not going to go through every single one. But for Plotinus, just like Plato, the soul is divine. The object of life is to understand how we might restore that soul to its original sort of proper place. And, the getting back to the one, the journey back to the monad. Now, this can only be done by knowing a comprehensive structure of reality. We have to have a comprehensive knowledge of metaphysics and reality and our place in the world in order to find the map back. So in many ways, the labyrinth mythology could be looked at as a kind of allegory for this. The kind of mythology of Minos and the labyrinth and so forth. And it's what a lot of the Platonists would do, is kind of go back, and Plotinus does this in the Enneads. He goes back and he looks at Homer, and he reads these sort of allegorical meanings into Homer. So you get a level removed from the grammatico-historical, this god beating up this god type story, and we're told, Eros is love, and it's not really about an actual god. It's an allegory for the principle of love, and love not falling into porneia or porno or whatever, or erotic lust fixation, but rather that it's pure chaste love. You get all these kinds of allegorical readings of Homer and Odysseus, which I'm not sure that that's totally wrong. I think sometimes it's either just totally clever creativity, but sometimes it does look like they're making an interesting case that maybe Homer was actually encoding those stories as allegorical myths. I don't know, but that's debatable. Regardless, I'm not saying, by the way, that has anything to do with theology. I'm just considering different approaches to Platonism and Homer, and there's all kinds of millennia of scholars debating this stuff, so these are not new questions. But with Plotinus, we want to stress the dissimilarity to Christianity. And again, it's entirely possible that Plotinus heard Christian philosophers, Christian theologians, speaking about things. Maybe he read some of them. Maybe he read Origen, who knows. And he could have borrowed a lot of their terminology and concepts. So could Plotinian ideology be a corruption of Christianity? That's possible. Now, I say that because nobody will entertain the thesis that I consider very viable, that when we look at the hermetic structure of the theology of Egypt or any of those ancient empires. So let's use Egypt. So we go back to Egypt, and one of the things that does distinguish Egyptian thought from Greek Hermeticism is the bodily resurrection. So at a certain point in Egypt's history, they appeared to have adopted some kind of monotheism and a belief in the resurrection. Now, I'm not saying that their views weren't totally corrupted, but what's interesting is, where did they get that idea? Well, the liberal scholarship will say, well, this was like some old form of monotheism, and then this degenerated into paganism or polytheism or something like that, and which is not our view. It's not the view of biblical inspiration. It's not Orthodox theology. We would say, what's more likely is that when Joseph was in Egypt, he influenced Egyptian theology, right? I mean, he has the ear of Pharaoh. That's every bit as possible, in my view, as well, actually, I think that's way more possible and likely than the higher critical liberal narrative of why Egypt had theological changes that it did. But regardless, the structure of the Egyptian Hermetica and so forth is basically the kind of architecture that you get in Plotinus. So Plotinus goes on, and again, if you read the Hermetica, you see that similarity very clearly. Whenever that Hermetica is from, who knows? Is it really Egyptian? I guess that's debated too. But whatever is likely Egyptian, again with the bodily resurrection stuff, that is a dissimilarity to Plotinus. We're not going to have any kind of bodily resurrection with Plotinus. So in this philosophy, there's no access to the divine through any kind of special revelation. So Platonic philosophy excludes revelation. And that's because all gnosis, all knowledge, is ultimately of the forms. Now, we might be duped by the phantasms in the material world and think that we're only understanding, base matter and so forth, as they would argue. But in reality, what we need to do is purify ourselves, and then the soul, the mind, soul and mind are kind of interestingly linked here, which will become another normative view in the West, the body-soul dichotomy, where intellect and soul almost become interchangeable. So in Plotinus, that is the so-called reality that we have to accept. And once we kind of are initiated into this, Plato type stuff, then what happens is you'll realize that philosophy is the real guide to life, not any kind of special revelation from spirits or gods. And philosophy will give you the complete account of reality. And in doing so, it becomes the guide to life. And that life is a signpost. It's a labyrinth, a maze, pointing us to going beyond the sensible, visible world. So to know that reality, very much in the same way as Plato, there is a need to purify oneself, to work to attain virtue, and it's not, to be fair to Plotinus, he's not saying that, it's just mental, like you just sit there and contemplate as hard as you can on the nature of being or something, and your soul will ascend into the heights. You also have to practice other ideas of Greek Platonic virtue, I guess. You have to understand aesthetics, and you have to know the good and know justice and all this kind of stuff that we talked about in the Platonic lectures that I did. And so in doing all that, the soul is then prepared for its progressive journey up into the one. So how then do we live properly in this view? what's the ethics here? Well, it starts with, again, dialectics, as we saw with Plato, and the assumption, the presupposition, the starting point of this system is that there is one monad blob unifying principle, a concrete, absolute, metaphysical principle, and it is beyond being, as it's called many times in these writers. Now, the beyond being is not in any way conceptual. It's not in any way tangible. It's not in any way knowable. It's ineffable. It's not a God. It's beyond the conception of God or any notion of God. It's not personal. It's beyond all that. And this one, the supreme principle, we might say, is in some way like mind, which is interesting because how can it be beyond being if it's supreme mind? But maybe, to be fair, he thought that he could overcome dialectics in that way somehow. I don't know. But the unity that we seek, right? We are fragmented. We have the multiplicity of experiences. We experience things through beginning, middle, end. There's change. There's alteration. That in the system is the problem. So the fact that there's multiplicity, the fact that there's many objects of our experience, that we change from day to day and we feel one way, we feel another way, that's all the problem. And you see the great one, the great monad, it's not like that. And if we could only be like that, then we wouldn't have all the problems we have. And so all of the forms, the Platonic forms in the world that are standing behind the phenomenal reality that we experience, even the forms still exhibit some kind of distinction and duality and opposition. And therefore, since they're not an ultimate unity, above mind, so to speak, is this ineffable one. So it's almost like, it's kind of like there's gradations. I should have made that a little bit clearer a minute ago, excuse me. Mind is actually a step below the one. So even mind is conceptual and is in some way an analogy between like the human mind and some sort of, and the divine mind. Okay, let me to make it clear, Plotinus is saying that the monad, the one, is even beyond that. So that's actually technically what the ineffable beyond being is. Mind and above the mind and above forms which are in that mind is the one. Now Plato will follow Plotinus as one again in saying that it is beyond being and totally apophatic, that is, nothing can be said of it in any positive way or known about it. And you can't even say that it, quote, exists, because whatever kind of existence the monad has, it bears no relation or similarity to anything in our experience. So when he calls it the good, it's very similar to what Plato says, in that the form of the good is above all the other forms and is beyond being. So ultimate reality is the one. Maybe in some way goodness is closer of an approximation, but even still you can't predicate goodness of the one, because it's beyond being, beyond all conceptuality. If we were to give a name to the one, it would be the good, he says. So back to Parmenides in the old lecture, there was a notion of this kind of monad unity. And that's kind of what a lot of the ancient Ionians and so forth, what they were seeking was some grand unifying principle. But they always wanted to make it impersonal. And of course, that's the same thing that Plotinus is doing. So unqualified oneness, absolute divine simplicity, is the one. Now, from this one, descend various emanations and degrees of reality, that as you go down the tree of reality, so to speak, there is less and less unity, and thus less and less reality. So this scale of being comes into play here, the Greek scale of being, which will be very influential in the medieval Christian West, especially when you read the scholastics and all of this speculation about the chain of being and all this stuff. It continues on for a long, long time. Now, that's not to say that every single aspect of metaphysics or medieval metaphysics about being is necessarily wrong. I'm just speaking of general trends here. So in these degrees of reality or emanations from the one, again, as we move further away from the one, there is a noticeable differentiation and particularization that leads to less and less unity and less reality. So as we move down from the one, we lose that super essence and we fade towards non-being. Now, the one is said to overflow in this way as a kind of emanation in these descending levels all the way down to the physical universe, which is kind of at the bottom of this scheme, this pyramid here. And these emanations are kind of like the sun. So we can look at the light of the sun, and maybe it fades away as it gets further or something like that. And the further away you are, the weaker the power and heat of the sun would be. So thus, in order and in structure, we can say the fabric of this thing, the universe is unchanging, and it is static, but it is alive. So it's not dead matter. It's full of life. There is a cyclical celestial sphere dance that the universe does in orbital pattern around the one, around the monad. This will be, again, very similar to all the traditions of the celestial spheres and Neoplatonism, and even in Aristotle talks about the celestial spheres and how all the spheres move in a circle around the monad. And so at the highest level, the fullest sense of the good, there is pure act. It is self-contained, thought thinking itself, even perhaps the way that Aristotle characterized his quote-unquote God, which is not the God of the Bible. Thought thinking itself, total, complete contemplation, and stasis. There's no change, no alteration, no movement. And so the life of the here and the now, the physical level that we experience, these are faint images, precisely because they change and are therefore in some way lesser than the static, perfect, super beyond essence. Now this obviously will be rejected in our theology, because change, alteration is not in itself bad. Time isn't inherently evil. There's nothing wrong with any kind of. There's no dialectic at work here, and St. Gregory of Nyssa is very good in refuting the heretics who argue this, particularly the Platonists, this kind of stuff, where we don't do that. We don't say that, right? Because if once we say that, it's impossible for there to be an incarnation, right? The highest good could in no way incarnate, because it's absolutely in dialectical tension with time and change and space. That's, again, why we're not Platonists. Neoplatonism would exclude the possibility of an incarnation. So there's a flow within the universe which consists of a downward movement from the one. But some of these beings, particularly man, has the ability to also have an upward movement back towards the one. Now, how is that going to happen? Well, Plotinus is going to construct this elaborate superstructure of metaphysics to where there are three hypostases or persons. Now, you might say, well, now, wait a minute. Did the Christian church rip off Plotinus? No. Hypostasis, it comes from the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, and it comes from the New Testament text. So hypostasis was used in our revelation prior to the coming of Plotinus on the scene. Now, individual substances that make up the intelligible universe are three. The one, and mind, and soul. So this is the triad of Plotinus. One, mind, and soul. Mind will emanate outward from the one, and it's automatic. And it has the potential itself to know. So you have this ineffable beyond being one, the monad, and it emanates outwardly a lesser entity called mind. And then by this act of contemplation, the world of forms arises. So the mind that springs forth from the one, we could think this is very similar to the story of Athena and Zeus, right? Doesn't Athena spring from the head of Zeus? This thought form world is the result of this first emanation. Now, so when this happens, mind wants to be united to the one from whence it emanated or radiated. And so the world of forms, the ideals that are generated by mind, is the way that the one or the good is known by mind. So again, it's very bizarre, but so it comes out from the one, mind, quote unquote, and mind wants to know its origin, the one, the monad, and so it thinks about the forms, and in those forms it contemplates the one. By the way, this is almost exactly the way that Aquinas talks about knowing the essence of God and the archetypes in the essence of God. This absolute unity is known at the level of mind through the multiplicity of forms. Of course, I don't know how that's supposed to happen, but the forms then have this high degree of unity. And mind, when it knows these objects, it becomes like it. So mind is its own thoughts. Thought thinking itself, right? Aristotle. However, that isn't the absolute level of unity, as we saw. That was the one. The forms only represent the monad or the one at the level of the contemplative mind. So mind or nous thus timelessly emanates or radiates from the one as a potency or ability to know. And thus timelessly mind actually knows the one as the multiplicity of forms. Very bizarre. By the way, is in no way the Orthodox theology of the Trinity. For one, when you can see this replicated in the debates that Athanasius has with the Arians, because the Arians have all of these same Plotinian presuppositions, as Origen would earlier than them. Origen, borrowing all this theology, would try to say the same stuff. He would try to say, well, I guess the Son, being the second emanation, is in some way a kind of lesser being. And that's what the church had for a damn good while have to combat this presupposition. And when Athanasius fights with it, he says there's no dialectical tensions in God. There's nothing dialectically in opposition by saying that the Father eternally generates the Son. You can have those two things be true and the Father and the Son not be in any kind of lesser, greater ontological distinction. Now, the Father, we believe, is the arche or prime principle of the Trinity. He's the beginning and source of the Godhead, the fountain of deity. But the fact that there's a logical distinction, St. Basil says, between the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, or an ordinal distinction in that the Father is prima in patres, right? So, kind of collegiality, so to speak, does not mean that there's less dignity, honor, deity, etc., or glory for the Son or for the Holy Spirit. That is at least the rallying cry for the first several centuries battling the Arians. But I want you to notice, and this is something that has been pointed out by different Orthodox theologians, is the similarity between the Plotinian starting point and presupposition of what the one or the monad or God, quote unquote, is, and that of the Arians. And by the way, Eunomius, when Eunomius has his version of Arianism that he argues with St. Gregory of Nyssa, St. Gregory responds by all the things that I'm saying to him, that you're hearing me say in a response to Plotinus. So, what is then the third emanation? So, one and mind also contemplate their distinction, and because it is discursive thought, and it's a thought process that has successive thoughts, rather than being intuitive, mind's contemplation or thought is intuitive, so this is the highest level, and therefore to have a lower level, the springing forth of the third of the triad can't in any way be natural. It has to be, or what's the word I'm looking for? It happens discursively. That is, it happens by reasoning process. So mind thinks about all these forms, and it thinks about its relationship to the one, and this gives birth to soul. And soul is then a lower level of emanation and reality from mind. So what's the triad here? One, mind, and soul. Monad, dyad, triad. Now the soul is the cause of everything in the sensible world. And it represents the intelligible world to the sense world. So the mediator between mind and sense is soul. And then once you ascend from soul to mind, you have to ascend from mind to monad, to one. Although it's distinct from mind, the top levels of soul touch the realm of mind. See? So it's the bridge. And with mind, it can rise to self-transcendence and unity with the one. So you have to climb the ladder of the emanations. So these three hypostases are distinct, and they are hierarchically arranged, but they're not totally cut off. So again, faint images of the idea of the Trinity here, but the Trinity has just been replaced with these different intellectual concepts and weird ideas of thought thinking itself and so forth. And so the one and the mind are always present to the soul. And because the emanations are lower than the starting point, they have to in some way be in movement and particular. So the life of mind itself is pure stasis and rest. The soul, like the mind, desires to know and be itself. So there's a succession to its awareness to know, a continuous series of thoughts then. And so it cannot grasp truth all at once like mind can. And so the soul is the logos of the mind. It is an expression or direct image or representation of a higher level of reality to a lower level. So here we have a misuse, a co-opting of the idea of logos, where it turns into a mystical, magical mediator between grades of reality that, as we said, are different. So this is a, what's the word I'm looking for? Is this a trinity? It is a kind of trinity, but it's not a trinity like we teach. In this trinity, the levels are lesser and greater. And we don't believe that. There's no chain of being in God. So reality becomes an unfolding process from the top down from maximum supreme unity down into a total differentiation and particularity, multiplicity. And as we descend down the chain of being, you come to non-being. The closer that you move towards the further that you move away from the one, the monad, you're just like shooting yourself towards non-existence and non-being. So the good, the monad. You've been listening to the first half of my talk on Plotinus and the Enneads and deconstructing them, as well as pointing out the Hermetic influence that would come to be in the West. If you want to hear the rest of this talk, then you can subscribe at Jay's Analysis for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year. Thank you for listening.